Hello, this is Dr. Lukes, and in this video lesson we want to talk about the proper formatting for tables, figures, and graphs for these professional reports. Point of view here is for the unit operations courses, but these same rules kind of apply more generally, so when you do a design report, for instance. Rule number 1, when in doubt, pick up a textbook, pick up a technical journal, and look at what they do, and use that as your style guide. But let's look at some examples from published works, and most of these are going to be from textbooks that we've used throughout our courses. This first one's from our design course. Notice there's a title above, there's section or column headers. Here the units are included, the numbers are lined up so that decimals align. Okay. Here's another one, again, no grid here, right? And more. These are just various tables taken from various textbooks of yours. Here's one that's a little bit more complete because it has all these reactions in here, but still a similar format where the section header is enclosed in just a simple bar. There's another bar down at the bottom, and then the numbers all nicely lined up. Okay, so now let's look at some samples of reports from students' work from the past. So first of all, you do see that they have a table with a title here, okay, and that's fine. But they've got all the bars, right? The grid is fully on there, and that actually makes it harder to read. They would do better to have a little bit more space between lines and just have that blank space. It visually would be more appealing and easier to read. There are some other ways that I might do this. For instance, there are a lot of common things like irritants and so forth, and so you might have had categories with check marks or something like that. There are other ways that you can present this more readably. This is heat exchanger network, so these are from design reports. And notice that the alignment is kind of awkward on these. I probably would have done these so that I had centered this on the column. Again, they have this here is unnecessary because that's in the title, so you didn't need this line. And then I would have just separated these off again with that common bar and then left off the grid. This, I mean, there's not a table number for one thing. They use awkward capitalization, which is a separate issue, but this is not a meaningful table, let me just say. Okay, this one is getting close. Okay, but again, now then they've centered everything. They've also used ridiculous significant figures in this particular case. I love this price estimate to the penny, okay, when it's over $300,000. Here's one. This one's a real pet peeve of mine. Table 5, initial component separation conditions, stream 1, 2, 3, 4H2S 5. And then the next page is all of the information. Okay? No, that's bad. Okay? And they've used the little star for multiplication. If you're going to use scientific notation, use the X. Okay? The way that they taught you how to do it when you were a little kid, that was actually correct. Okay? Star is how we talk to the computer. We also never use the E, right? 10 to the negative 12th and use superscripts. So, common things that you need to be aware of. Title goes above the table, okay? And it describes the contents of the table. A long title is acceptable, okay? The column headings should include units if those are appropriate. You draw a line at the top and bottom of the table and under the heading of each column. And then the independent variable is the one that goes in the leftmost column. We're going to write the numbers so that the decimals align in a column if it's a value that has meaning. If it's just a designation like stream 1 or something like that, those can be centered. A few more tips and tricks. You might want to include the order of magnitude in the heading. So kind of like including units. Go back and look, especially thermotextbooks and heat transfer data tables commonly have this order of magnitude in the heading. And that just simply means that now then I can write all my answers as like 1.23 instead of 1.23 times 10 to the negative 7th or 0.00 whatever. Okay. Take control of multi-page tables. If it gets split between 2 pages, then you need to repeat the heading at the top of every page. Okay. There are some ways to do this. I frequently put a hard return and start a table if it's a very lengthy table. You can move material. The table does not need to immediately follow the mention of that. If it has to go on the next page, that's okay. All right, try to keep it very close, but if it's a page away, that's all right. Take control of your significant figures. Do not let Excel tell you what to do, okay? Use the significant figures that are appropriate and meaningful for your report. Be consistent in your capitalization and your abbreviations. Whatever you do at one place in the report needs to be done throughout, and that includes your tables and graphs. When you refer to this table in the report, so you're going to mention that table 1 contains blah, okay, whatever was in that table. Why did you include it? If you don't have a reason for including it, then don't put it in the appendix, okay? If you included it in the body of the report, then tell people what information they're supposed to get out of this. So, this is a list of the numbers that were used, for this, calculation, or so that they can see the order of magnitude change from point 1 to point 2. Why did you include this as a table? Okay. If the sentence only repeats the title, then you might want to reconsider why you put that in the report. Okay. Now, figures and graphs. Here are some also from literature. So in this particular case, the figure titles go at the bottom, okay? You do not do the figure built into the graph like what Excel wants to do, because you're going to be putting the figure with a complete description of what's in that graph down below the figure or the graph, okay? So more examples from textbooks and literature. Now this one, notice, has an A and a B. So there were 2 different reaction pathways shown here. And so they want to show you what those 2 options were. But the title describes both. So what you need to know. Title is below the figure or graph. It's going to describe the contents of the graph. And it may give a little bit of additional context, such as experimental conditions. Maybe you repeated the experiment at 10 degrees and at 30 degrees. Great, okay? Then that goes into the title. If you have a lot of similar figures, you might want to combine them with subparts. So like that last example there where you have an A and a B. So graphs have variable names with units as the axis titles, okay? So volume, parenthesis, cubic meters, whatever, okay? So be sure that you include the units, and that's going to be your axis title. Back on these titles, don't use versus, okay? It's a description. It's not X versus Y or whatever. Just don't do that, okay? That's not a good title. You want to scale the axes so that the space is filled. with a small caveat. Sometimes if you exclude 0 in your scaling, it gives a false sense of what's going on. So if you've excluded 0 and you think there's any risk that the reader will not understand, then you want to be sure that you specifically inform the reader, okay, in your paragraph. If you have multiple data sets, you need to include a legend. It might be part of the graph, or you can put it in the title. If you have multiple graphs that show similar data, use the same scale for all of them, or else explicitly tell me that it is something different than that. Okay? When you get to using multiple data sets, one of the issues is going to be that you want it to be clear and easy to distinguish. So you want to use markers that are simple shapes and easy to distinguish. They will allow you to do things like a plus sign and a times sign and a 6 thing star and an 8 thing star as your markers. Most people don't pick those up real quickly. Go for the simple shapes, the circles, the squares, the triangles, okay? Now you might wish to use color in your graphs. I actually think color is great. However, you need to add to that a texture difference. So red triangles with a solid line, blue circles with a dashed line, something like that, okay? About 1 in 20 of your readers will be colorblind, maybe a little bit more than that. Engineering tends to be a little bit more masculine. So be aware of color blindness. And so always give not just color, but also a texture difference so that your reader will be able to see your graphs clearly. Red-green is the most common combination to avoid. So particularly try to avoid those, but that's not the only kind of color blindness. A few other things. So generally, when you are doing this, your raw data or calculated values, usually we use markers on those and no lines. And then we'll use a smooth line to show our model on top of that, okay? Don't use the connect the dots. Almost never do I use connect the dots in Excel, okay? You want to add a grid when the graph is being used to read values from the graph, okay? But if all you're wanting to do is see trends, like, oh, this is going uphill or it had a maximum, in those cases, don't put a grid. It just clutters things, okay? Now, if your variable is limited, and this picture that you've been looking at over there is a bad example, okay? The bottom axis is composition. It's physically limited to being between 0 and 1. Then you need to control the axis and only allow it to show between 0 and 1. What the heck is this region over here between 1 and 1.2? Okay. So the graph should have ended here. Sometimes if you have multi-scale data, you may need to use a logarithmic scale. Excel allows you to do it. Just try it and see. If it makes it better, then use it. But when you do that, be sure that you mention it in the graph title. When you create a graph in Excel, it's going to put a title up there, which normally, if you're just turning in that Excel sheet, that's what you want to do. But when you're putting it into your report, you're going to have a title down below. That gives you 2 titles, and they generally end up conflicting. You don't want 2 titles, you want only 1. So remove the title if you're putting it into a report like this. This is just a weirdness of Excel. Sometimes it will want to paste it and connect the picture that you, or the graph that you put into your report, connect it to the data. And then you send someone the report and they no longer have access to the original data file and the graph goes blank, or someone goes in and types something else in there using the same sheet for another purpose and it changes the graph. So the safest thing to do is once you get your graph looking the way you want it, copy it and paste it in as a picture, okay? That way it can't get screwed up. If you are including images from another source, check the quality, all right? Be sure they're not low quality so that they distracted from the paper. You'll notice that some of these that we had in this slide deck were kind of low quality, okay? Often you really didn't need that graphic, and so decide whether or not you want to include it, because it will be a distraction when it's low quality. If you are giving an image from another source, also be sure that you reference that, okay? When you refer to the figure in the report, point out what key items should be gleaned, okay? Don't leave it to the reader to make sense of it. I assure you they will come up with something different that they saw in that graph, okay? If you're not referring to the figure for some reason, then don't include it in your report, okay? Now you're going to refer to this as figure 1 or graph 1. Probably figures are better than graphs for our titles, and so, figure 1 might be a picture, it might be a graph, but we're going to call them figures 1, 2, 3, whatever, okay? We're going to say, as can be seen in figure 1, the flow rate increased as the temperature increased. I have no idea. That makes no sense. Okay, but I didn't say as can be seen in figure 1 below. Okay, we're going to take all those aboves, belows. We're going to get rid of them, but we're going to refer to them as figure numbers. Okay. Now, final things about the numbers that we use in our technical reports. Whenever we use a number, always include the units. Okay? And if you have a number that's less than 1, we're always going to use a leading 0. You're going to write 0.1. You are never going to write 0.1. Okay? Always include the leading 0. You want to make sure that you are using consistent units throughout the report. So don't at one point start with kilopascals and then move to bars and then to PSIA. Okay? The only reason you would do that is if the purpose of the report was to talk about the weird units or the unit conversions or something. Okay? Otherwise, do not change units. Make a choice. Stay with it. Okay? Pay attention to your significant figures. The significant figures should reflect the appropriate error magnitude. Okay? So I've got a couple of bad examples here. 1.3 plus or minus 0.0001. If you really think that you have 4 decimals before you have your error, then that number here needed to include 4 decimals. Okay? The place of your error, okay, needs to match the place of the value. And here, now, those both match. They both are showing 4 sig figs, or 4 decimals rather, 3 sig figs. But the problem here is our error, 0.0173. Now, error, you get 1 digit, so 0.02. So this should have been 0.03 plus or minus 0.02. Right? And then we always put a space between a number and its units. Now there's an exception with temperature. Temperature is weird. Okay. If you use the degree symbol, then they get smashed up against each other. So the degree sign goes in that space. And there is a degree symbol that you can insert in Microsoft Word, okay, as one of your symbols. But if you really are desperate, you can use a little o and superscript it, but it's going to be too big. Really, find that symbol. Now, temperature is really weird because also Kelvin doesn't get a degree sign, and so therefore it gets a space. Okay? Otherwise, for everything other than these 3, there's a space between the number and its units. All right, so this wraps this up. Thank you very much, and happy report writing.